I'm Peter Austin, that is Winter's Gibbet, and this is interesting. About 30 miles south of here right now, two men are currently on trial at Newcastle Crown Court for the felling of the famous Sycamore Gap tree, an incident that caused national outrage, international outrage in fact, last year. With an estimated value of £620,000 plus the damage it did to the adjacent Hadrian's Wall, which was built by the Romans the best part of 2,000 years ago, they both face up to a decade in prison. And yet, they should probably count themselves lucky, because as recently as the late 18th century, men convicted of felling a tree could be executed, as could those found guilty of a whole host of other, strangely petty-sounding crimes. This was what would later become known as England's Bloody Code. In 1689, there were only 50 crimes punishable by death. Jump forwards to 1815, though, and that number had risen to over 200, including such heinous acts as staying for over 30 days on a traveller's camp, penning a threatening letter, and pickpocketing goods worth just 12 old pence. That's about a fiver in today's money. And there's a lot more where that came from, so stick with me and I'll go through all the best ones. First, though, we do just need to look at why there was such an increase in the list of capital offences. And you might start to get a picture of that if I tell you that under the Bloody Code, you could also be put to death for merely being found wandering around the woods at night with a blackened face. Not in possession of anything in particular, not damaging anything, just being in the woods at night with coal dust or soot on your face. Indeed, a lot of the capital offences that were introduced in the 18th century came in under the so-called Black Act of 1723. Britain was facing a period of economic downturn at the time, leading to an increase in social unrest and thefts on the part of its poor and very hungry citizens. Poaching, in particular, was rife, and after a series of raids carried out in Hampshire by a group who blackened their faces in order to hide their identities, the Black Act of 1723 was passed, introducing the death penalty to a whole series of crimes. But they weren't just limited to poaching. For instance, an individual could be put to death for as little as stealing a singular rabbit, but also for just threatening to set fire to a haystack. And it wasn't just the punishment that was harsh. Anyone wanted for a crime under the Black Act who was still at large after 40 days could simply be declared guilty in absentia, branded an outlaw, and then executed almost immediately after their eventual capture. Forget about having a trial, this is the Bloody Code we're talking about. Even children weren't safe. It was thought that kids up to the age of 6 didn't really have the moral compass to be declared truly felonious, even if there was evidence they'd committed a pretty serious crime. But if prosecutors could produce strong evidence of malice in a child as young as 7, they were for the noose, just the same as anyone else. MPs were clearly doing everything they could to protect the interests of landowners to the detriment of the commoners. For hundreds of years, there'd been a provision in law called the benefit of clergy, which allowed members of the church, and later anyone who could read and write, to be tried in ecclesiastical courts, which tended to be more lenient. You would usually avoid the death sentence there. However, changes to the law in the late 18th century meant that most of the new capital offences that had been introduced were not subject to the benefit of clergy, including laws like the theft of livestock. Indeed, a number of commentators at the time linked the incredible harshness of these new measures with the fact that a lot of MPs were landowners themselves. It seemed that, at best, members of Parliament might have been acting out of self-interest, but it was even viewed by some contemporaries as a deliberate act of class suppression. Either way, the reasoning offered by the lawmakers themselves was that the Bloody Code, not that it was called that back then, was supposed to be a strong deterrent in the face of rising crime. It's no coincidence, really, that hangings were very public affairs back then, and gibbeting also sometimes took place. That is not a hangman's gallows behind me, but a structure from which the already dead body of a convicted criminal would be suspended to slowly decompose in full view of the local community. Admittedly, this one is a 19th century reconstruction, but it stands on the site of one that was used to display the corpse of a local murderer during the time of the Bloody Code. Not many originals still stand, partly because you can't stick a wooden structure like that out in the middle of a moor like this and expect it to still be around 200 years later, but also because there was a long-standing folk belief that splinters from gallows and gibbets could be rubbed onto the gums if you had toothache. Dead man's wood. Contrary to that sort of thinking, though, this was the Age of Enlightenment, and you might think that as Britain underwent an industrial revolution and such superstitions began dying out, that these draconic laws might also start to shift. It wasn't quite that smooth sailing, though. In fact, members of Parliament would actually add the likes of destroying a textiles machine to the capital offences list before any meaningful reforms started to come in. And even when it did, it was a slow and very messy process. In 1808, for example, Parliament decreed that convicted pickpockets should no longer be sentenced to death. Hooray! And yet between 1810 and 1818, the House of Lords rejected 4 bills that aimed to abolish the death penalty for burglary to the value of 5 shillings, which is about 30 quid in today's money. In other words, if you took £30 worth of goods out of someone's house, you were very much for the noose, or the gibbet in this case, but if you took £30 cash out of someone's pocket, you were off the hook. Well, relatively speaking, anyway. One of the biggest steps forward came with the Judgment of Death Act of 1823. This allowed judges to use their discretion when sentencing people for these so-called capital offences. And counterintuitively, this actually increased the number of convictions. You see, jurors had sometimes refused to send people to the scaffold for some of the more heavy-handed laws under the Bloody Code. But now that judges were able to show leniency, guilty verdicts became more common, albeit with fewer death sentences attached. Now, the capital offences still existed on paper, of course. In fact, as late as 1832, you could still be hanged for forging money, but the list would gradually dwindle in the coming decades, and by 1861, the only people at risk of being executed were those found guilty of murder, high treason, piracy with violence, espionage, and the rather niche arson in royal dockyards. These last vestiges stood for about another 100 years before capital punishment was wholly abolished in the UK, and in 1964 England's last executions took place when Gwyn Evans and Peter Allen were convicted of murder following a botched burglary. Which almost brings us back to modern day and the Sycamore Gap case, if it weren't for a similar incident that took place in the interim that also feels worth mentioning. In 1984, there was a comparable cause for national outcry when the Blue Peter Garden at BBC Television Centre was vandalised by unknown culprits. Now, rumour has it that professional football players Les Ferdinand and Dennis Wise may have been involved in some way, but that's by the by. The point is that, as well as destroying plants and a 100-year-old urn, the culprits also poured oil into the fish pond, which is interesting because looking back on the Bloody Code, it's clear that the use of execution in the 18th century was totally out of proportion, especially in the eyes of the general public. And yet it only takes a bit of mindless vandalism levelled against an iconic site to tug at the public's heartstrings enough that phrases like "string them up" start being bandied around, as they were in the case of Sycamore Gap. And so perhaps provocative tabloid journalists and angry internet commenters should pour one out tonight for the Bloody Code, which would have seen all manner of delinquents swinging from the gallows, or the gibbet if it were still in force today, not just for chopping down trees, but yes, even vandalising a fish pond. I've been Peter Austin, and hopefully that was interesting.